appreciate you sharing a little bit about that, Massimo. I enjoyed in the beginning of the book, you write something that made me laugh a little bit, so I thought we would start there. You write, so what did Socrates really think about whether virtue can be taught? Well, that's complicated. Why is it not as straightforward as one might think?
Well, it's complicated because Socrates actually changed his mind. We're talking about talking to other people and changing your mind. Socrates apparently changed his mind. There is a Platonic dialogue, the Meno, where Socrates raises the question. In fact, one of his friends raises the questions of, can virtue be taught? And Socrates says, well, let's take a look. And in the end, he says, well, maybe in theory, but I don't see any teachers of virtue. I see teachers of many other things, not of virtue. The sophists pretend that they're teaching virtue, but they're really not. And so since there are no teachers, I had to conclude that this is something that simply cannot be taught. Otherwise, somebody would have found a way to do it. So that's a fairly negative conclusion, right? But then there is another dialogue, Platonic dialogue again, the Protagoras, which is dedicated to a sophist, in fact. Protagoras was one of the major sophists of the time. So typically, Socrates' arch enemies, right? But Protagoras actually insists with Socrates that, of course, virtue can be taught. It is a skill, and it can be taught. Now, the typical reader of Platonic dialogues will look at that and will say, oh, I know what's coming. This is a sophist saying that. Now Socrates is going to show that the sophist is wrong, and he's going to reach the same conclusion. But instead, by the end of the dialogue, surprisingly, Socrates has changed his mind. He agrees with Protagoras. He says, you got a good point there. You made a good point. And Protagoras makes a number of arguments in favor of the notion that virtue can and should be taught. And he basically says it's a techne, what the Greeks call a techne. It's a technique. It's something that you learn by looking at people who are doing it and by practicing. So imagine, in fact, the analogy there is with learning music, right? So imagine Protagoras says that the survival of the city depends on everybody playing music. You can be sure that we will have a lot of music teaching programs put in place because our survival depends on it. Now, does that mean that everybody's going to become a Mozart as a result of these programs? No, of course not. Some people have an aptitude for music, and they are in fact Mozarts, and they will improve. They will still improve because even a Mozart, even a prodigy, will improve if he's well taught. But they will improve rather little. Some will improve a lot because they have some level of aptitude, but not quite as high as a Mozart. And then some other people barely will be able to, to play a recognizable tune, but they will still be doing better than they were before. The same goes with virtue. So virtue is the kind of thing that has a bit of theory, just like music, right? If you want to play an instrument, learning a little bit about musical theory will help. It's not a minor thing. But most of it is practice. And how do you learn that practice? Well, you go to a good master, to somebody who plays the music well, who can teach you, can correct you about how to play the instrument. And then you just spend hours and hours and hours and hours doing it, right? And of course, not only Protagoras was one of the teachers of the time, but Socrates himself turns out to be one of those teachers, right? They have a different approach. They do it differently, but nevertheless. And so the basic idea, therefore, is that, yes, virtue can be taught, but you better start. It's hard to teach virtue to somebody in midlife, in the middle of midlife crisis or something like that. And you need to be careful about where you learn your theory and who you're going to pick as your teacher in terms of practice. Again, to use another analogy, how did you learn sculpting and painting in the Renaissance? You went to a master's workshop and learned from the master himself and from his students, right? But it would make a difference whether you went to Michelangelo or Leonardo on the one hand, or the schmuck around the corner who doesn't really know very well and makes barely a living out of it. You learn much better from a Michelangelo.